Hello, Skilliard here with just a little overview of the different methods that DirectX 12 uses to utilize multiple graphics devices to overall improve performance in games. Um, but before we get into that, you kind of need to understand what exactly buffering is. You've probably heard the term before, such as if you're trying to watch a video online, you hear people complaining about buffering, but most people don't really know what it is. And basically, the idea of buffering is that the content is made ready before it's actually needed so that it can be sent out right when it's needed. So if you're watching a video online, like a live stream, it might actually send you, 5 to 10 seconds before you actually need it. And then it goes out as the content goes on. That way, if your connection stutters or something, the video doesn't stutter because it has time to catch up and stay ahead. Now, with video rendering, it uses buffering too, called frame buffers. And if you've heard of triple buffering, it's essentially rendering 3 frames in advance before they actually happen. So now with that, it can cause input lag because you're rendering things before they happen. You might be 3 frames ahead, which means that you press something, it might take 3 frames until you actually see it. So, but the longer the frame buffer, the less likely you'll encounter stutter. So it's kind of a trade-off. You increase the frame buffer, there's less stutter, it feels smoother, but the gameplay itself might feel like it has a bit of lag. And that's basically just a quick understanding of frame buffering. Now I can explain the old way that games have generally utilized multiple video cards, and that is a method called alternate frame rendering. And basically how it works is every video card that you have takes turns rendering a frame. So for example, the first video card will output a frame, the second one outputs a frame, and then the first one outputs a frame. And basically what they're doing is they're building frames into the buffer, and they'll still take a while, but because they're working on separate frames, they can sort of do their own thing and take a bit longer, and you still get a lot of frames per second. Um, so you essentially can take double the time to render a frame and still achieve the same frame rate because there's 2 cards working on frames, at least in theory. Um, and basically, because they're both rendering the same things essentially, the VRAM, the whole content of VRAM, such as textures and everything else, is basically cloned across the 2 devices. So if you have 2 video cards with only 4 GB of VRAM, it's still only 4 GB usable. You don't get 8. Now there are some advantages to alternate frame rendering, and that's that it's highly efficient because of each card rendering its own frame. They don't really get in the way of each other. There's less overhead because they don't have to communicate as much, and there's less organization needed because they're kind of doing their own thing. And then it's easier to implement from a developer standpoint because it's pretty simple, using Sly or Crossfire. And then it's really good at cinematics that aren't very interactive than split frame rendering because, once again, input lag isn't really a problem if you're not playing or if it's not that big of a deal. Um, Now, there are disadvantages of alternate frame rendering, and that's the first thing being that 4 GB plus 4 GB does not equal 8 GB, meaning that your video card's VRAM doesn't you don't actually get more out of it. Basically, because they contain the same content, it's not like you have 8 GB that can be used to store 8 GB worth of textures because they're storing the same thing. And then another problem is display lag becomes a serious problem at low frame rates or if you have too many video cards. Because each video card is rendering its own frame, it takes it longer to actually create a frame. For example, if you have 4 video cards running a game in 4K with Sly at just 30 FPS, it would take 133 milliseconds just to render each frame. This is because 4 GPUs are taking turns, creating their own frames, and timing them to increase smoothness by rendering in advance. While the gameplay may look smooth, the input lag might make the game feel unresponsive and intolerable. Because if you have 4 of them rendering at 30 frames per second, each video card is only rendering 7.5 frames per second because they're doing it like each doing their own frame. And it's technically not input lag, as the game will still process your input, but the display will lag behind. So that's why I call it display lag and not input lag, because it's technically not input lag. It's just what you see. Now, the formula to calculate the display latency caused by alternate frame rendering, in theory, is 1 divided by the frame rate times the number of video cards. So, for example, if you have a three-way SLI at 60 FPS, it's 1 divided by 60 FPS, times 3 video devices for a 50 millisecond delay. Now, this isn't like perfect example because they might build the frame buffer differently. The game might decide to use triple buffering or do things a little differently, but that's just the general idea. And another problem is that SLI requires that you use the same video card. And then Crossfire, I think it allows different AMD video cards, but if you do that, then the weaker one will obviously bottleneck the system, because if one of them is slow at rendering frames, then the other one will have to slow down so that it doesn't get ahead of the other one. So those are just some problems with it. And this is pretty much the way that current games are handling SLI and Crossfire, if they currently support it. Now, split frame rendering is a new feature with DirectX 12 that essentially splits the screen into tiles, and each graphics device decides to render its own section. Now, these tiles are not necessarily the same size. You can split it manually or automatically, like using a program or whatnot. So you might have each video card doing half the screen. You might have 4 video cards doing a quarter of the screen. You might have like one video card doing 2/3 and one doing 1/3. It really depends. And then devices are in fact working on the same frame, just different sections of it. So it's not like alternate frame rendering where they're doing separate things. Like, they're doing their own section, but it's still the same frame, the same single image that they're working on. It's like if you're drawing a painting, you might be working on the right side while your friend is working on the left side, and you'll kind of each complete your own portion, like a mural or something. And then there are advantages for it. There's not higher display lag, as it does not require a larger frame buffer, because once again, they're working on the same frame. And since it's using more video cards and more power, it can increase frame rates, which is obviously good. You want higher frame rates. But there are some disadvantages of it as well. The first being it's not quite as efficient as alternate frame rendering. Rendering 50% of a frame does not equate to doing 50% of the work that's needed. And the best way to explain this is the device may need to do calculations for things that aren't within its section of the screen. And for example, if you have a tree that casts a shadow onto your screen, you might need to do some calculations associated with that tree, even though it's not something you're directly rendering. And so you might have each card doing 60% of the work as compared to if they did it alone. So it's not 100% efficient, but it's still better. And then another problem with it is it requires more communication and overhead. Because you have, 2 video cards working on the same frame, they need to communicate and kind of work together and just keep the whole thing, working as intended. The processor will have to figure out, what to assign which video card, and they have to communicate, okay, I'm done with my task, and, the main video card that outputs the display will need to combine, the finished portions that each video card does. And just all these things that it has to do to sort of put things together and communicate who does what is a bit more work than alternate frame rendering. So it essentially, to summarize split frame rendering, it increases frame rates. It doesn't increase it as much as alternate frame rendering because it's not perfectly efficient because of the overhead and communication and just some things being redundant. And there's another type of multi-graphics card features called, this isn't the official name, this is just the name I gave it because I couldn't really find an official name for it, and I call it post-processing offloading. And basically, if you don't know what post-processing is, it's basically the final step in rendering an image by applying various effects to it, like bloom or FXAA, or pretty much just simple filters that change the way the final image looks. And basically with post-processing offloading, the main video card would skip post-processing and hand it off to a second graphics adapter, which includes integrated graphics. You can do that. And because it skips that last step and gives it to someone else, it can begin the next frame sooner and in turn in theory, generate more frames per second. Um, and then while the video card is rendering the next frame, the integrated graphics or whatever your secondary graphics card is working on the previous one, finishing off the post processing and getting that ready to go. Now, the advantage of post-processing offloading is that the video cards do not need to be the same. In theory, you could use an AMD video card with an NVIDIA card, but that's assuming that neither company tries to prevent it by modifying drivers. I know that NVIDIA in the past used to allow you to use a secondary NVIDIA card as a physics card, and you used to be able to use NVIDIA as a physics card with AMD being your main video card, but then they killed that with a driver change, so I would not be surprised if NVIDIA did the same with this to try and maintain market share. We'll just have to wait for the future to see. And you can use AMD with integrated graphics, NVIDIA with integrated graphics, NVIDIA with AMD, at least in theory. So another advantage is you can use your onboard graphics, which is kind of great. I know a lot of people are all disappointed and upset at Intel that, oh, you put these useless integrated graphics that I don't want on my CPU, why can't you give me more cores or something? Well, you might finally find a use for this, which is kind of nice. That silicon won't go unwasted just being a pointless spare. You might find a use for it. And then another advantage is frame rates can be improved by basically, higher frame rates like all of them. Now, this comes with a few disadvantages as well. And the first being, if the secondary graphics adapter, such as your integrated graphics or a different video card, is too slow, your frame rates might actually go down. And the reason for this is if the integrated graphics, or once again, secondary graphics adapter, takes longer to do the post-processing for one frame than the video card takes to do everything before it, you will lose FPS because it just can't keep up. Now, this can be fixed, in theory, by dynamically adjusting the amount of effects that the integrated graphics or secondary adapter does. And the way you would do that by programming would be to check how much the integrated graphics is being utilized, and if it seems to be overloaded, then you might have the video card, do half, maybe 3/4 of the post-processing effects, and just have the onboard graphics do the rest that you think it can handle. But overall, it's very difficult to properly tweak it, and when you have, hundreds, thousands, millions of possible configurations and combinations, it makes it really hard to put this in an engine, which is why I personally don't think many developers will use this because it's just really tricky. And then another problem with it is it actually adds to the buffer size, which, as I've explained earlier, increases latency, which doesn't really make it a very good choice for competitive games like CSGO or esports or any kind of thing where you really need that instant reaction to your input. And for this reason, I also think that using integrated graphics alongside a high-end video card won't really work that well. If you have a GTX Titan and you're hoping that your measly integrated graphics on an i7 will improve your frame rate, in some cases it can. There have been benchmarks and tests where it actually did help. Now, we don't know. You'll really have to see. It depends on how well the developers can code it. Once again, it's tricky, but it can work. But we'll just have to wait and see until DirectX 12 games come out and possibly use that. So for a quick wrap up, there's 3 types of ways that DirectX 12 will allow for multiple graphics devices to work together. And with alternate frame rendering, it's really good for getting the highest possible frame rates at high resolutions, but it has the downside of really high display latency. So it's really good for cinematics, and it's really good for slow-paced games that you want to look really cool, where you don't care about those few extra milliseconds of just delay on the screen. I mean, if you just want the game to look pretty and you want it to look smooth, alternate frame rendering is pretty good. But once again, I would not recommend it for competitive games, just because that increased delay can really mean a lot, especially in first-person shooters, because seeing that person even a 20th of a second later could mean losing the game and dying. Now, split frame rendering is probably the best of the 3 for competitive games and esports, because the input lag is not increased by over just using one video card. and you still get higher frame rates. So if you're trying to push, 144 hertz at 1440p or something, this is really good for that because you can get that extra horsepower to get those frame rates at those high resolutions without sacrificing latency. And then post-processing offloading can be pretty good in some niche cases, really depending on how the developer implements it. If you have a low to mid-range video card and it's bottlenecking you, the integrated graphics could, in theory, really help a lot. Like increasing frame rates dramatically because you can reduce some of your load. It can take up a lot of the work and just free up a lot more space for the main things. So it's very good in that case. Another good case would be, let's say you decide to upgrade your video card. You have a pretty good video card, but you want to have an even better one. Well, you don't want to just sell off that old video card. You don't want it to just sit in your basement collecting dust. So maybe you can run it, on a second slot, have that do some post-processing for you and kind of boost frame rates. So that's a good case too, if it's like something stronger than integrated graphics, that might work well against a really high-end video card. But really, with post-processing offloading, it really depends on how the developer implements it, how good of a job they do, and who really bothers to decide to bother with it. That was kind of redundant. Anyway, so that's just a quick overview of the 3 features. If you liked it, leave a comment, subscribe, do whatever you want. Plan to make more tech videos, and thanks for watching.